Good evening. Welcome to Book Club Babble. My name is Maribel Garcia, and I am here with the author, Liane Carter, and she is the author of Ketchup is My Favorite Vegetable, A Family Grows Up with Autism. Liane, thank you so much for being with us here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
The way we like to do author's cut since the print interview has been out is, we'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about the book, and then we'll get into some of the questions that our viewers have. And tonight we're doing something that we usually don't do, and I'd like to have Liane read a little bit about the prologue, which I thought was, really powerful. So Liane, tell us about yourself, Mikey, the book, and how this all got started.
Well, I was started out as an English major. I knew nothing about autism. I'm really a recovering English major. I worked in book publishing. And when my son was first diagnosed, I knew nothing. All I knew came from movies like Rain Man, or there was a TV show called St. Elsewhere. You're probably a little too young to remember it, but it was...
I remember it.
Oh, okay. There was an autistic little boy there. So really, that was the sum total of my knowledge. And I was desperate to learn. And the problem was, it was the early 90s. The internet didn't exist because Al Gore had not invented it yet. And there was nowhere you could go to look up anything. There was no Google. There were no chat groups, no Facebook. There was nothing. So instead, I went to libraries and bookstores, and I was hungry to find a book that would be titled something like What You Expect When Your Child is Autistic, but it didn't exist. And all the books that I did find were about little kids, and it was basically, this is how I cured my kid, and if you do this, you'll cure your kid too. But autism adulthood was just this uncharted terrain, and I wanted a roadmap, and it just didn't exist. So eventually I wrote the book that I wish that I had had when he was a lot smaller. It's not a book how I cured autism, obviously. I didn't. He's still autistic. But I think it is a very hopeful book. I think essentially it's a family love story, and it's about how we try to create an ordinary family life while dealing with the extraordinary needs of an autistic child. Book's been well received, but I think I also wrote it for people who don't live with this. I really wanted to open up that world to the general reading public.
That's wonderful. I didn't know you were in publishing because I had somebody say, make sure you ask the author. And she's the mother of an autistic child who says, those of us who, now I said, Liane is a gifted writer, and I write that in the review. It's you're writing, of course, it all makes sense now. You're publishing and you're an English major. It is just beautifully crafted and you're a skillful writer, wonderfully done. So how old was Mickey? Were you journaling, or when did you start taking down notes? And when did you say, you know what, I'm going to write this roadmap?
That was a long time coming. When he was first diagnosed, we were very busy going to therapy, and that really consumed most of my time. But I also at the time freelanced for a lot of magazines. I was writing regularly for McCall's magazine, which is no longer around, and Parents magazine, and Child magazine. So those were all articles on things like how to raise a more resilient child.
Right.
But they were not personal articles. I couldn't write about it for the first few years. And then when he was about 6 or 7, my editor at Family Life magazine said, can you write something personal about, what's it like to raise a special needs kid? And that was really the first time I ever attempted to do it. And that saying, I think it's Hemingway, writing is easy, just open a vein and let it pour.
Right.
I found that once I opened that vein, I couldn't stop. So I started to write a lot of essays about him, and eventually some of them found their way to Motherlode in the New York Times and other places. And it was more of a process. I thought, maybe I have a whole book here. And then I thought, okay, maybe I have a book of essays. Mm-hmm. And then I happened to go to a conference called The Art of the Essay at Fordham University. And one of the speakers there said that trying to publish a book of essays was publishing poison. That was the phrase he used. I guess it's sort of akin to trying to sell a book of short stories.
Right.
Published a novel.
Right.
So at that point, I thought, okay, I'm not David Sedaris. I'm sure as hell not Joan Didion. So I tried to massage the essays into a more of a coherent narrative, really, with a narrative arc, and to create structure, like connective tissue between the pieces.
Right.
And that,
Well,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, that's wonderful. That's it. I think that's a great point of departure. Speaking of a narrative arc, let's have you read those 2 paragraphs in your prologue that I think that for those of our readers who haven't, read the book yet, just to give a little bit of, let's just give them a little bit of that real world, because to me, I thought it was incredibly compelling. This is from your prologue.
What if a stranger had the power to decide if you were a good enough parent to your child? Our 17-year-old autistic son, Mickey, was about to become a legal adult. We were petitioning the surrogate court for guardianship and had asked our special needs attorney to begin proceedings. My husband, Mark, and I took Mickey to the lawyer's office so that the paralegal could officially serve him with papers notifying him that we were petitioning the court on his behalf. He must have felt our tension because he refused to stand, he refused to shake her hand or make eye contact. Standard behavior for him in a new situation when he is scared. Standard anxiety for us. As part of the procedure, the court has appointed mental hygiene legal services for Mickey, the paralegal said. Basically, their role is to complete some interviews with both of you as proposed guardians for him and with anyone else they feel would be a useful source of information. The court will rely on their report to determine if this guardianship is a safe and appropriate one for Michael.
Wow. Tell us a little bit about this proposed guardianship. All I know is that I still didn't know too much about this, but this is the beginning of the book. And for me, it was just, are you kidding me? Wow. He's 17 and that's when it hits me, everything that you have to deal with and how invasive these people that are supposed to be helping you can be. So tell us a little bit about what's going on here and why that was required.
It's a state law. Well, it's a federal law here in New York. You must, before a child turns 18, petition the court for guardianship. And basically, they appoint a temporary guardian for your child, and then they send someone into your home to evaluate whether you have a safe and appropriate home for your child, the child that you have spent 17 years raising. It's a system that is set up to protect all children, and logically I get that. But the way it made me feel was as if somebody had called Child Protective Services on us.
That's what I thought. That's how it felt.
That's exactly how I felt. And I know that, reasonably, I know that that's not the way it is. It really is just the system. They weren't singling us out. But it was a very uncomfortable position. The woman called, she made an appointment, and her name was actually Aretha Franklin. Did not make that up. And before we made the appointment, I went on a flurry of house cleaning. And, like when you're selling your house, they tell you bake cookies or bread. Right. The house smelled great. So right. I did all of that. I was just in an icy hot bath of nerves for days until she showed up. And once she did, she was lovely. She was incredibly young. She could not have been a mother herself. She looked like she was barely out of college.
Wow.
And she asked us, why do you want to be his guardian? And I said, isn't it obvious?
Wow.
He's my child. Of course I would.
Right.
I can't imagine not being his guardian.
Right.
So she interviewed him, and it went well. And yes, they found that we were appropriate guardians, but it was still harrowing to go through because I kept thinking, what if it makes you second guess everything you've done as a mother?
Right. That's exactly what I felt like just reading it. And it was, I think it was a great way to start the memoir because it was just so jarring and it just gave us just a little bit of what you have to live through. Now, so in this case, when they find, is this so that they could institutionalize or what's the deal? What happens when they don't find you fit? Where does the child go?
Oh, I didn't even want to go to that place in my head.
Okay.
I don't know anyone that's ever happened to.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure. I
Okay.
imagine that the court appoints a guardian at that point.
Right. But yeah, so that was, and what was I going to say? So I asked you the question about you one of the questions that I was going to ask you, and you just brought it about, you would have loved a book that was about what to expect when you're when you have an autistic child. If a book like that, if there were to be a book like that, kind of like that, that edition that comes out every 2 years, do you think we'll get there soon, where you will have something for parents, where they'll have a bigger set of resources? Like you say, it was the 90s, and a lot of the chat rooms, just the community, online community, and books, those resources we don't have. What would you like to see in a book like that?
Well, I'm not sure that we need a book like that at this point. I think if you go to a website like Autism Speaks, they have this wonderful downloadable kit. It's called the 100 Days Kit, and it's really everything that you would need to know right after you get a diagnosis.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I helped put it together a long time ago now. So I don't know that you would need a book anymore. I think that the web offers you terrific resources.
That's wonderful. So can you go over that website again?
It's autismspeaks.org. It's called the 100-Day Kit, and it's basically everything you should do in the first 100 days after a diagnosis.
Oh, that is wonderful. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about is, I think, a big part of your book, and I think it was more of it was almost like a journalistic memoir type, where you really dug into the research, and when you really talked about Mickey's, just going through the public school system, and you happened to go to you're in a great system, and it was so frustrating to see that they just couldn't get it right. Can you tell us about this process, and how these lack of resources for non-neurotypical students and children, just the lack of them, and how hard it is just to get.
I think, as I've mentioned, my school district is a bit of a college prep factory. They actually did a very good job for him in the elementary school, and even somewhat in the middle school. It was really when we hit the high school that the great divide happened, because usually when a child turns about 14, you begin transition services, and you reach a point where you have to decide, am I going to pursue an academic track, more of a life skills track, or a combination of the two? And our high school really had no experience with that life skill track, because they were so focused on every kid goes to college, they really didn't know what to do with kids who might be more vocationally bound.
Right.
So traditionally they would send a kid like mine out of district, but this was the first year they decided to keep those kids here in the district and try to provide an education. But it was a real struggle, because they hadn't done it before, and there were a lot of missteps along the way.
Right. Actually, when I look back at reading the book and some of those assignments that Mickey had, I was getting anxiety myself. So yeah, I was thinking of some of the math he was assigned, which seemed ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, he was coming home with assignments like, what's the role of mitochondrial DNA defined? Or write a report on the role of the clergy in medieval Europe.
No.
He could barely put together a paragraph at that point. He was dealing with. He needed more functional language.
Right, and when I think about that fight that you had, or those struggles with the school district, things that seem so basic, because I mean that was incredibly frustrating. What do you think is being done? And I'm sure things are a little bit better, but I don't know, what can the rest of us do to ensure that we just get better services?
If you are you talking about in the school system,
In the school system, like in the,
I think that classes need to be more inclusive, and I think there is a move in that direction. But that said, some kids still don't thrive in an inclusive classroom. They still need more individual one-on-one care. So it's
right.
there's no one answer that suits everybody's needs. But I think there's a model now in our elementary schools here to it's a co-teaching. So you have a special ed teacher and a mainstream teacher, and the kids are in a mixed classroom. They can get the individual attention they need, but I think it's very helpful for them to be around typically developing peers. And I think it's also very good for the typically developing kids. They learn so much in terms of empathy.
Right.
I think everybody benefits.
That's wonderful. I had another reader who wanted you to really discuss this. I'm thinking, and you addressed Jenny McCarthy in the book as well, and how she really, as a celebrity, she feels like she cured her son, with diet or different, and I think there was this big movement, the vaccines, and that the way you stated it is that you were hungry for a non-recovery?
A non-recovery story.
A non-recovery story where, and I think that this parent said, ask her, since she's still so new, she's like, how do we get over it like that? Because we feel like, oh my gosh, what if there is a cure, and and because I know that you all, and maybe you could talk, you dealt in the book how you did see some people who claimed to, cure, and you spent some money on that. Tell us about that part of your journey.
I would never judge anybody who tries any of these things, but that being said, we had a lot of ground rules of our own. I think there was a certain desperation initially for us, and we would have done anything, but at the same time, we kept saying it had to be safe, non-invasive, not painful.
Right.
And that said, we tried special diets and vitamins. We did a couple of alternative therapies, but again, nothing invasive, nothing scary.
Right.
I don't feel like I want to cure him anymore. I think I moved past that. I think that certainly addressing any underlying medical issues will help. If a child is having GI problems, which is pretty common for kids on the spectrum, if you can do something to ameliorate that, at least they're more available for learning. So, but that's not a cure.
Right. And actually, that's a good segue into epilepsy. Like I think I was telling you in an email that I have a dear friend whose child is, being, tested, and I had no idea that, 33% of children on the autistic spectrum, there's a connection with epilepsy. That was the first time. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I'm really glad you went into it in your book.
It's actually, it may even be higher. They say anywhere from 30 to 40%. Nobody told us about that initially.
Wow.
That there was such a high comorbidity. It wasn't until he started having seizures that we learned about it. I don't know why no one spoke about it. We saw a few seizures when he was young. Looking back now, I think he was having absence seizures where he would just go blank for a few seconds.
Right.
And we attributed that to autism. But it really wasn't until adolescence that, something about those hormones just sort of causes neurological havoc, and that's when they kicked in big time.
Do you think there's a reason? Because, I may not be a parent of an autistic child, but, I have family members and friends, and I thought I knew a little bit more, and I was really, I couldn't believe that this link was so big, and we haven't, that's pretty significant. Why do you think we don't hear so much about it? What do you think is going on there?
That's a great question. I'm not sure why that is. And I would like to think that perhaps that's changed since we first got a diagnosis. I think there's just a lot more awareness of it. Statistically, I didn't know anybody with autism 25 years ago. Most people didn't. So I certainly wouldn't have known about that connection.
Right.
Today we know so many kids with autism that, of course, you're going to hear a lot more about the epilepsy as well.
Right. What has been the reaction? Because that's, of course, that's always my favorite part, especially with my favorite genre, with memoirs. And when you write a story that really needs to be told, and it just reaches to so many people, and there's a reason why it needed to be told, it touches people. Tell us about, how people have reacted to your book, and how people, their reactions have been to Mickey's story, and
It's really been gratifying. I've heard from many parents who have kids on the spectrum who have said, "Oh, that's my story. The details are different, but that's still our story."
Right.
So it's nice to know that I've done that. But in some ways, I'm more gratified when I hear from people who haven't lived with this, who have no idea, who say that I've opened their eyes and sensitized them, and then I feel that I've really accomplished something very positive. But that being said, I think it's positive for the autistic community as well, because it's so lonely when your child is first diagnosed, and there's
Right.
nothing like finding that community. And it took me a long time to find my fellow tribe members.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think that what was so powerful was just getting snapshots of, and how frustrating, because you think that, oh, it's 2017, we're so far along, and we're not as far along as we'd like to think, and it's not until someone really writes about these, there was a way that, and you have again a really beautiful way of telling your story, and of crafting your narrative, where you say that having a child is like carrying your organs on the outside of your body, and that is kind of how you wrote. And we could see how vulnerable, and as a parent, that's how we all feel. And it was just, you really took us there, and we are so glad that you wrote this, and thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Do you think what next? What are you working on, a second project? What?
I've always got something percolating. Right now, I've been writing a lot of essays. I don't have a book yet in mind. But this book started as essays too, so I'm sort of waiting to figure out what my through line is.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about the topic of the essays, or the general subject matter?
They've been all over the map. I mean, some have still are. I did one called the Not So Empty Nest Syndrome, which is it's a continuation of what's in the book. That was in the Chicago Trib a couple of years ago. I'm also writing a lot from the perspective of being an older parent now, and how scary that is. I'm also doing a lot of reflection back on the very strong women in my life. I wrote a bit about my mother in the book, and my dad, but I feel like I didn't really give them their due yet.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm just noodling, really. I don't have a book in mind yet.
Well, you're a fabulous writer, and we hope you keep writing, and we are looking forward to more of your work. Liane, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
And yeah, thank you so much.